before there were walls, before canals traced lines to the sea, before the name Nan Madol was spoken aloud. There was only the island of Pohnpei breathing quietly in the Pacific. The island was green beyond measure. Rain fell often, not in anger, but in patience, soaking the forests and feeding the rivers that slid gently from the mountains to the reef. Mist clung to the high ridges, softening their shapes, as if the land itself preferred not to be fully seen. The people who lived there did not yet build monuments. They lived in clans, bound by kinship memory and land. Authority was not fixed in stone or crown. It moved like water, resting with those who remembered the old stories, who knew the rituals, who could trace ancestry back through generations spoken aloud at night. The sea was not an edge. It was a road. Canoes crossed between islands, carrying shell ornaments, tools, songs, and warnings. Knowledge traveled slowly, but it traveled far. In this time, the world was layered. The living shared it with spirits, ancestors, and unseen forces that shaped weather, fertility, and fate. Certain places were already known to be thin, where the distance between worlds felt shorter: caves, peaks, groves, and sometimes, strangely, the shallow water near the reef. It was into this world that the first stories of two brothers began to drift. They were said to come from the west, though no one could agree from where exactly. Their names changed with each telling, Olisipa and Olasopa most often, but the essence remained the same. They were seekers, builders, men who understood how power could be gathered and held. They tried first to establish their authority inland, but the land resisted them. The soil was wrong. The spirits were restless. The clans would not submit. So the brothers turned their gaze away from the forest and toward the lagoon, toward the unstable place between land and sea. And there, over shallow water and coral, the idea of Nan Madol was first imagined. The stones were not yet cut. The canals were not yet drawn. But the place had been chosen, and once chosen, it would not be forgotten. The brothers did not arrive as conquerors. That is important to understand. They arrived as observers, listening more than they spoke, watching how authority flowed to the island without ever settling in one place. They learned the names of the clans, the rivalries, the rituals performed at planting time and at death. They learned which spirits were feared and which were asked for help. Olisipa, the elder, was said to understand rituals and incantations. He knew how words, spoken in the correct order, could bend events slightly out of their natural course. Olasopa, the younger, was more practical. He studied materials, coral, timber, stone, and how they behaved when shaped by human hands. Together, they believed something radical for Pohnpei at that time. That power could be centralized, not borrowed from ancestors, not negotiated between clans, but fixed, anchored to a place. Their first attempts failed. They tried to build inland, where stone was plentiful and the ground solid, but the clans resisted. Inland land was already claimed by lineage and memory. To build there would mean war, and the brothers were not ready or willing. to rule through open violence. They tried ritual dominance instead. Olisippa is said to have performed ceremonies meant to call authority to himself. But the spirits of the island did not respond as expected. Some stories say Olisippa grew ill during these attempts, as if the land itself rejected him. It was after this failure that the brothers turned fully toward the reef flats. The shallow lagoon offered something new, a place belonging to no clan. It was neither land nor sea, neither farm nor fish in the same way. Politically empty, spiritually ambiguous, dangerous, yes, but also uncontested. To build there would require effort beyond any previous undertaking on the island. But that, too, was part of the vision. If power was difficult to reach, it would be harder to challenge. The brothers began small. They ordered the clearing of coral heads. They marked lines in the water with poles and rope. They chose a central islet, what would later be known as Nan Madol was, the heart of the complex. And then came the first great problem. There was no stone suitable for monumental building in the lagoon. The basalt lay far away, on the other side of the island, and yet somehow the stones would come. Not yet, but soon. As the people watched the brothers labor in the water, skepticism slowly turned into curiosity, curiosity into belief, and belief quietly into obedience. Because anyone who could imagine a city where the sea itself had to make room was someone worth paying attention to. The basalt did not belong to the lagoon. It slept in the high places of Pohnpei, locked inside ancient volcanic flows, dark and dense, broken naturally into long, hexagonal columns as if the earth itself had already shaped them for building. These stones were heavy beyond reason, some longer than a canoe, some weighing several tons. No wheels existed, no metal tools, no draft animals, and yet the stones moved. This is where history and legend begin to braid together, and they never fully separate again. The practical truth is that the basalt was quarried, or more accurately, split and freed from outcrops inland. The columns fracture along their natural lines. This made them easier to stack later, but did nothing to solve the problem of transport. Oral traditions speak of stones floating, lifted by chants spoken by Olisippa. Some versions say dragons carried them. Others say the stones were persuaded, not forced. Archaeology is quieter. It suggests coordination, ropes woven from fiber, log rafts, slow movement along rivers, then along the coast, and finally across the lagoon. Even with this, the effort would have been immense. Moving a single column would have required dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people working in rhythm, timing with tides, waiting for calm water, accepting losses when stones sank or broke. This labor changed society. Clans that had once acted independently were now drawn into a shared project. Participation became obligation. Obligation became loyalty. Loyalty became hierarchy. As the stones arrived, the lagoon began to transform. Artificial islets were raised by stacking coral and filling gaps with rubble. Basalt columns were laid horizontally, crisscrossed at the corners like giant wooden beams made of stone. Walls rose directly from the water, their bases invisible beneath the tide. The first structures were not homes. They were symbols, platforms for rituals, enclosures where access was restricted, spaces where silence mattered. Olisipa did not live to see the city fully take shape. According to tradition, he died during the early construction phase. Some say from illness, others say from spiritual exhaustion. His death marked a turning point. Olisopa buried his brother within the growing complex and assumed full authority. From that moment on, Nan Madol was no longer an experiment. It was a seat of power. The stones kept coming, and with each one laid, the lagoon forgot what it had been before. With Olisipa gone, Olisopa stood alone at the center of what was becoming more than a construction site. He took a new name, not a personal one, but a title, Saudeleur. It meant something close to Lord of Delos, or master of the sacred place. From this moment on, the authority of the ruler would not come from clan ancestry, but from proximity to Nan Madol itself. This was a revolution. The Saudeleur system broke with the old balance of power. Instead of many chiefs tied to land and lineage, there was now one supreme ruler, elevated above the clans, living apart from them, surrounded by water and stone. Nan Madol became the physical expression of that idea. The complex expanded steadily. More than 90 artificial islets were built, each with a specific function. Some were residential, others ceremonial, others funerary, each surrounded by seawater, each separated by narrow canals that controlled movement and access. The most important islet was Nan Madol. Its walls were thicker, higher, more carefully built than any others. Inside, a massive central enclosure held the royal mortuary, where Saudeleur rulers would eventually be buried. The stones here were placed with particular care, stacked higher than a man could reach. Access to Nan Madol was strictly controlled. Only priests, attendants, and the ruler himself were allowed inside. To step there without permission was not just a crime. It was a violation of the sacred order. Daily life at Nan Madol followed strict ritual patterns. Food did not grow there. Water did not flow there. Everything had to be brought in by canoe from the main island. This dependence was intentional. It reinforced separation. The ruler did not farm, did not fish. He ruled. Tribute flowed toward the lagoon: breadfruit, taro, yams, fish, shell valuables. The clans inland were now bound to supply the city in the sea. At first, the system worked. The Saudeleur maintained peace between clans by standing above them. Rituals were standardized, calendars aligned. The old gods were honored, but now through the ruler. Nan Madol glowed with meaning. But centralized power, once established, does not remain gentle forever. And as generations passed, the Saudeleur grew more distant, more demanding, and more feared. The water that protected the city also isolated the ruler from the people. And isolation changes those who rule. There was a time when Nan Madol was complete. The canals were clear and navigable. The walls stood sharp-edged, dark against the bright water. Canoes moved through the city like thoughts moving through a mind that believed itself eternal. From a distance, Nan Madol must have looked unreal. a city not rising from the land, but resting on the sea, as if placed there by intention rather than effort. This was the height of the Saudeleur dynasty. The ruler lived surrounded by attendants and priests, his presence mediated through ritual. Ordinary people rarely saw him directly. When they did, it was during ceremonies, framed by stone and shadow, elevated and remote. Each islet had a role. Some housed priests, keepers of genealogies, and chants that bound the ruler to the gods. Others were kitchens, where tribute food was prepared but never eaten by common hands. Some were reserved for nobles and administrators who oversaw the flow of goods and labor from the main island. The city was quiet. Sound carried differently over water, and movement was controlled. Narrow canals forced single-file passage. Walls blocked sight lines. Nothing in Nan Madol was accidental. At night, torches reflected on the lagoon. Chants echoed softly between stone corridors. The city felt suspended, neither fully alive nor dead. But this perfection had a cost. The Saudeleur demanded increasing amounts of tribute. Food, labor, obedience, all flowed one way. The ruler's isolation grew, and with it, suspicion. New taboos were imposed. New punishments introduced. The old clan chiefs were reduced to intermediaries. Their authority eroded, and resentment spread quietly inland. There are stories, difficult to separate from myth, of cruelty, of arbitrary executions, of ritual humiliations, of a ruler who tested loyalty by suffering, whether literal or symbolic. These stories matter because they reflect the truth. The Saudeleur were no longer seen as balancers of power, but as its hoarders. Nan Madol, once a unifying center, became a reminder of distance. The city remained magnificent, but it no longer belonged to everyone. And when a system of power stops listening, history begins to prepare correction. Every long rule eventually attracts its opposite. In the stories of Pohnpei, that opposite arrived not from the mountains or the clans, but from the ocean itself. His name was Isoclecal. He was not born on Pohnpei. Most versions of the tradition place his origin on Kosrae or another island to the east, beyond the horizon. His father was said to be a god, often identified as Nan Sapwe, a thunder or war spirit, and his mother a woman of high rank, whether divine or symbolic. The meaning is clear. Isoclecal did not belong to the existing order. He grew up hearing of the Saudeleur, of their city of stone and water, of their demands, of the suffering they caused. Some stories say his mother sent him away deliberately, knowing he would one day return as a correction. Others say he left on his own, compelled by fate rather than instruction. What is consistent is this: Isoclecal did not come alone. He arrived with followers, warriors, supporters, families, enough to form a serious challenge, but not so many as to provoke immediate destruction. His landing was careful, strategic. He settled inland, away from Nan Madol, among clans already weary of Saudeleur rule. Unlike the Saudeleur, Isoclecal did not isolate himself. He ate with people. He listened. He learned local customs rather than imposing new ones. Slowly, allegiance shifted. The Saudeleur noticed, but too late. Protected by water and ritual, the ruler believed Nan Madol was untouchable, that the city itself was enough to hold power in place. But stone does not move on its own, and power, once challenged, must respond or fall. At first, the darkness did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, the way rot does, invisible on the surface, working underneath. In the inland villages, people began to speak more softly when Nan Madol was mentioned. The city was no longer described with awe, but with unease. Parents warned children not to play near the lagoon at night. Fishermen avoided certain channels after dusk, claiming the water there felt heavy. Isoclecal listened. He did not speak openly against the Saudeleur. He let others speak for him. Stories spread on their own. Stories of excess, of rituals that demanded suffering rather than balance. Stories of priests who no longer slept, who muttered to stones as if expecting answers. In Nan Madol, something had changed. The ruler, the last Saudeleur, had grown obsessed with control. Isolation had curdled into paranoia. He trusted fewer attendants. Priests were punished for mistakes in chants that had been spoken the same way for generations. Rituals multiplied, as if repetition alone could hold the world in place. At night, torches burned longer than before. Chants grew harsher, more urgent. Not prayers, but commands. Some said the ruler was trying to bind the spirits tighter, fearing they were slipping away. Others whispered that the spirits had already turned their backs, and that the Saudeleur was ruling a city that was spiritually hollow. Then came the first disappearances. An attendant failed to return from Nan Madol. A priest was last seen entering a restricted enclosure and was never spoken of again. No bodies were found. No explanations given. Water is very good at keeping secrets. Meanwhile, Isoclecal began to test the edges of Saudeleur power. Small acts of defiance. Tribute arriving late. Canoes diverted. Messages unanswered. The response from Nan Madol was severe, but clumsy. Punishments were ordered inland, yet carried out by intermediaries who no longer believed. Authority, once absolute, now felt desperate, and desperation leaves a scent. Even within the stone corridors of Nan Madol, some began to feel it, that something was wrong not just politically, but cosmically, as if the city itself was listening and no longer approving. In the canals, algae thickened. Walls were not repaired as quickly. The water grew darker, more stagnant, especially around the oldest islets. People started to say the city was sinking, not physically, but in favor. And when a place built on ritual loses the trust of the unseen world, it becomes only stone and water. The first blood was not spilled in battle. It was spilled in ritual. Inside Nan Madol, beneath walls that had never heard screams meant for mercy, the Saudeleur ordered a ceremony meant to reassert dominance over the unseen. The chants were old, older than the dynasty itself, but they were spoken with a new tone, urgent, sharp, afraid. Offerings were demanded in greater number, not just food, not just shells, lives. Those chosen were attendants, servants, people without lineage strong enough to protect them. They were taken to inner enclosures where the water lapped softly against stone, and they did not return. No announcement was made, no mourning permitted, but the lagoon noticed. After that night, fishermen reported strange things. Fish floating belly up near certain canals. Eels abandoning familiar crevices. The water near Nan Madol grew colder, even under the sun. Stone remembers pressure. Water remembers disturbance. The priest began to dream, not visions but repetitions. The same corridors, the same footsteps behind them, the same sense of being watched from below, not above. Some refused to sleep inside the city anymore. At the same time, Isoclecal moved. He did not attack Nan Madol directly. He understood its nature too well. Instead, he severed its lifelines. Tribute canoes were intercepted. Storage areas inland were emptied or burned. The flow of food became erratic. For the first time, hunger entered the stone city. Hunger changes belief. The Saudeleur responded with fury. Messengers were sent demanding obedience, carrying threats sealed with ritual markings. Some never returned. Others came back shaken. Speaking of inland villages where the Saudeleur's name was no longer feared, only hated, inside Nan Madol, the ruler withdrew completely. He stopped appearing even to priests. Orders came indirectly, relayed through whispers and symbols. It was said he spent long hours alone in the central enclosure, speaking to the stones as if expecting them to answer back. And sometimes the attendants swore. He answered himself in a voice that was not quite his own. The city felt different now. Torches flickered without wind. Sounds echoed where they should not. The water in some canals stopped reflecting the sky. Nan Madol had been built to separate ruler from people. Now it was separating ruler from reality. Nan Madol stopped sleeping, not in the way living places sleep, with quiet and renewal, but in the way wounds refuse to close. Night after night, the water between the islets grew still, unnaturally so. Canoes drifted without wake. Sound died quickly, swallowed by stone corridors that now seemed to bend it inward. Even the insects were fewer, as if something in the air discouraged life. Inside the city, hunger sharpened into cruelty. Food stores were guarded like shrines. Attendants fought in silence over scraps. Priests altered rituals, shortening offerings meant for the spirits and keeping portions to themselves. Each compromise was small, almost invisible, but Nan Madol had been built on precision. Deviation weakened it. The Saudeleur had not been seen for many cycles of the moon. Some said he was ill. Others said he was transforming. Whispers spread of a ruler who no longer ate, who drank only water drawn from a specific canal near Nan Madol. Water said to taste metallic, bitter, wrong. Those who touched it too long complained of numbness in their hands, of dreams filled with pressure and drowning. Then the walls began to bleed. Not blood as men understand it, but seepage, dark stains where basalt blocks met, oozing during high tide, leaving salt-crusted marks like old scars. Priests tried to scrub them away. The stains returned. At night, figures were seen moving where no one was meant to be, shapes crossing canals without boats. reflections that did not match bodies. Some attendants fled the city by swimming, preferring the risk of open water to what was forming among the stones. Those who remained began to hear it, a sound beneath the water, not a voice, not quite, more like pressure, a low, constant presence, as if something vast was shifting slowly below the foundations, aware now that it had been used. Nan Madol had been built by forcing stone to obey. But stone, given enough time, decides what it remembers. Inland, Isoclecal prepared. He did not rush. He waited for the city to hollow itself out. He understood that a structure built on fear eventually turns inward, consuming its own supports. When his followers asked when the attack would come, he told them only this: the water will open a way. And in Nan Madol, the water was already listening. The night it began, the tide rose without warning, not violently, not as a storm. It rose incorrectly, too high, too fast, pressing against the islets as if testing them. Canoes tied to stone rings tore loose and drifted into walls with dull, hollow sounds. In the narrowest canals, water spilled over the edges and flooded walkways that had remained dry for generations. Inside Nan Madol was. The priests gathered, frightened now beyond ritual language. The chants they spoke no longer followed sequence. Words overlapped. Names of gods were repeated too often, as if quantity could replace belief. And then the boundary failed. From one of the oldest canals, one rarely used, choked with shadow even at noon, something surfaced. Not a creature in any clear shape, not a spirit with form or name. Those who saw it later could never agree on what it was, only on what it did. The water there thickened, darkened, and rose higher than the walls, as if gravity had briefly forgotten its task. The canal did not overflow. It stood up. An attendant stepped back too slowly. He did not scream. His body simply folded inward, collapsing as if the space inside him had been removed. When he hit the stone, he sounded empty. Panic broke what discipline remained. People ran, but Nan Madol had never been built for running. Dead ends trapped them. Narrow passages forced them together. Some fell into canals and did not resurface. Others swore they felt hands, not grasping but measuring. Deep inside the central enclosure, the Saudeleur finally emerged. He looked wrong, thinner than memory allowed. Skin stretched tight, eyes reflecting torchlight like wet stone. He raised his arms and began to speak. Not chant, not prayer, but command, the same tone that had once moved people, stones, an entire island. Nothing answered him. The water surged again, higher this time, breaking through walls that had stood for centuries. Basalt blocks shifted, grinding against each other like teeth. Nan Madol had been designed to keep the sea out. Now the sea was inside. By dawn, parts of the city were submerged. Several islets were unreachable. Bodies drifted between stones, turning slowly with the tide, their faces already unrecognizable. And still, the pressure beneath the water did not leave. It waited. The Saudeleur stood alone on the highest stone of Nan Madol was, surrounded by water that no longer behaved like water. The priests were gone. Some fled. Some were taken. Some simply ceased to be where they had been a moment before. What remained was the ruler and the city, and beneath them, the pressure that had been growing for generations. He began again. This time, he did not speak the old chants. He spoke names. Names of spirits bound into service long ago. Names of ancestors pressed into obedience. Names that had once been whispered with care and were now spoken like chains being pulled tight. For a moment, it seemed to work. The water stilled. The stones stopped shifting. The air grew heavy, expectant. Then the lagoon answered, not with sound, but with memory. The Saudeleur felt it flood him. Every command ever given, every life taken to maintain distance, every ritual performed without balance. He staggered as if struck, clutching at the basalt beneath his feet. He had believed power flowed downward, but what rose now came from below. The water around Nan Madol began to recede, not draining away, but pulling back in a wide, deliberate circle, exposing slick stone and coral beneath. The city stood briefly revealed, naked and wrong, its foundations never meant to be seen. And in that exposed ring, something moved, not emerging, not attacking, simply turning. The Saudeleur screamed then, not in fear, but in rage. He tried to command again, to force the world back into shape through sheer will. The stone beneath him cracked. A single basalt column split along its length, clean and final, the sound sharp as bone breaking. The ruler fell to his knees as water rushed back in, higher than before, knocking him forward into the flooded enclosure. He did not drown. That would have been mercy. The water closed around him slowly, pressing, holding, keeping. His body did not float. It sank, drawn downward into the heart of Nan Madol, into the space meant for kings. When the water finally stilled, the Saudeleur was gone. No body was ever recovered. Only the sense, shared by all who later dared approach, that something had been added to the city, not removed. Dawn came reluctantly. The sun rose over Nan Madol as it always had, but the light felt thin, as if it did not wish to touch the stones directly. Mist clung to the canals, not drifting, not lifting, only hovering, heavy with what the night had taken. The city was broken, but not ruined. Some walls had collapsed. Several islets lay half submerged, their edges gnawed away by the sea. Debris floated between the stones. Fragments of canoes, woven mats, objects once sacred now stripped of meaning. And bodies. They drifted slowly, turning with the tide, bumping gently against basalt like offerings no one had asked for. The water was quiet now, too quiet. Those who had survived the night moved carefully, stepping as if the ground might remember them. No one spoke loudly. No one chanted. Ritual had failed, and silence had replaced it. Far inland, Isoclecal felt it before he saw it. The pressure in the air had changed. Birds lifted from the forest in uneven waves. Dogs whined and refused to approach the shore. The sea no longer carried sound the way it had before. He gathered his followers and moved toward the lagoon. They approached Nan Madol at low tide when more of the stone was exposed, and what they saw slowed them. This was not a conquered city. It was a consumed one. Isoclecal stepped onto the first islet and felt it immediately, a heaviness beneath his feet, as if the stones were saturated with something thicker than water. He knelt and placed his hand on the basalt. It was cold, not with night cold, but with the absence of warmth entirely. Inside Nan Madol was. The central enclosure was flooded to the knees. No throne remained. No ruler waited. Only water, dark and still, reflecting nothing. Isoclecal understood then. The Saudeleur had not been overthrown. He had been taken. And whatever had taken him had not left. Isoclecal did not claim Nan Madol as his seat of power. He ordered it abandoned. The stones, he said, have been fed too much. The water had learned the taste of authority. No ruler should live where the world itself had answered back. So Nan Madol was left behind, not destroyed, not cleansed, simply avoided. And places that are avoided do not empty. They wait. Abandonment did not empty Nan Madol. It sealed it. When the last canoes pushed away from the islets, when the voices faded and the ripples smoothed, the city did not return to nature. It entered a different state, one where time slowed and decay became deliberate. The water crept back into every space humans had tried to control. Canals widened their mouths. Cracks between basalt columns drank the tide. Algae grew thick and dark, not bright and living, but slick, almost oily, cleaning the stone like a film over an unblinking eye. No rituals were performed to close the place. That mattered. Spirits bound by command rather than respect are not released when their masters fall. They remain unresolved, like tension held too long in muscle. Soon, the fishermen noticed changes. Nets cast too close to the ruins came back torn, not snagged but shredded, as if pulled apart from below. Fish avoided the area entirely. Even sharks circled wide, refusing the channels. At night, the lagoon around Nan Madol did not reflect the stars. It absorbed them. Those who camped on nearby shores reported dreams they could not shake. Corridors filling with water, stone pressing inward, the sensation of being judged by someone that did not hate them, because hatred would require care. A few men tried to enter the city again. They said they were only curious. They said the old stories were exaggerations. None stayed long. One returned pale and shaking, unable to speak for days. When he finally did, he described hearing his own name called from beneath the water, spoken correctly, with the intonation only his mother used. Another was found days later on a half-submerged islet, kneeling, hands worn raw against basalt, as if he had been trying to scrub something invisible from the stone. His eyes were open. He had not drowned. No one ever claimed to rule from Nan Madol again. The clans rebuilt their lives inland. Authority returned to land. Lineage, balance. Isoclecal's dynasty ruled, but cautiously, always careful never to concentrate power too tightly, never forget what had happened when it was forced. And still the city waited. Stone does not forgive. Water does not forget. Nan Madol became a place spoken of only at night, and only indirectly, the place where the sea learned to answer back. Centuries passed. Not cleanly, not evenly, but in layers, like silt settling where the water slows. Nan Madol slipped from history into warning, and from warning into something harder to name. The elders still remembered, but they no longer explained. Children learned early which stories were not meant to be questioned. And then came people who did not carry those silences. They arrived by unfamiliar boats, speaking languages that cut the air differently. Traders first, sailors blown off course. Later, missionaries, explorers, administrators. To them, Nan Madol was not forbidden. It was curious. They wrote it down, measured it, sketched it. They stood on the islets and admired the engineering, the scale, the mystery, all without asking why the place had been left alone for so long. They slept nearby. They laughed too loudly. They touched stones meant to be approached only with restraint. The city responded, subtly at first. Compasses behaved oddly near the central islets. Notes taken at night were found damp by morning, ink blurred beyond recognition. Some claimed the air inside certain enclosures felt compressed, as if the walls were closer than they appeared. A few stayed longer. One foreign visitor recorded dreams of drowning while standing upright, lungs full yet still breathing. Another wrote of hearing footsteps behind him in empty corridors, always stopping when he turned. Local guides refused to enter certain areas. They waited at the edges, eyes fixed on the water, whispering warnings that were politely ignored. Then accidents began to happen. A man slipped from a dry wall into a shallow canal and broke his neck, though witnesses swore he had not fallen far enough. Another vanished between two islets in broad daylight, leaving behind only ripples that did not spread normally. These were dismissed as coincidence. Nan Madol had learned patience. The outsiders came and went, but the city remained, absorbing their presence, adjusting like a body adapting to a new parasite without reacting immediately. But each footstep, each measurement, each careless night spent within the old boundaries added something back into place. Attention, and places like Nan Madol do not wake fully all at once. They wake piece by piece. The first clear sign was not seen. It was felt. Those who stepped onto certain islets began to experience a sensation of being counted, not judged, not yet, but registered, as if the city were taking inventory of what had entered its body. People described pressure behind the eyes, a subtle tightening in the chest, the awareness of something aligning itself around them. At night, Nan Madol changed its posture. Walls that had seemed inert during the day reflected torchlight differently after sunset. Shadows stretched in directions the moon did not justify. In narrow corridors, footsteps echoed with a delay that did not match distance, as if someone else were walking a heartbeat behind. Some claimed the stones were warm. Others swore they were breathing. One explorer wrote of waking to find the water in the canal beside his camp perfectly still, smooth as polished obsidian. When he leaned closer, he saw reflections that were not his own, faces layered beneath his, older, thinner, watching upward. He left the next morning without packing his instruments. Local elders began to warn more openly now, but not with stories, with rules. Do not speak loudly near Nandawas. Do not enter the city alone. Do not stay after dusk. And above all, do not call out. Names carry weight in places built on command. Those who ignored this last warning sometimes heard answers. A man shouted to his companion across a canal and heard his own voice return, altered, flattened, spoken too slowly. Another called out in frustration after losing his footing and heard a whisper rise from the water, repeating his words perfectly, but without breath. The city was learning language again, and it did not learn gently. Objects went missing and reappeared in impossible places. Paths taken moments before seemed to shorten or lengthen without reason. Time behaved unevenly. Minutes stretched, hours collapsed. One night, a visiting scholar claimed to see a figure standing knee-deep in water at the center of Nan Madol, not moving, not emerging, waiting. When he blinked, it was gone, but the water where it stood continued to ripple long after everything else had stilled. Nan Madol was no longer just remembering, it was observing. And observation, once returned, is the first step toward interaction. Not everyone who entered Nan Madol was harmed immediately. That was the cruelest part. Some left believing themselves untouched. They returned to boats, to villages, to distant countries, carrying notebooks and photographs, convinced the stories had exaggerated the danger. But Nan Madol does not act like a predator. It acts like a current. Days or weeks after leaving, the symptoms began. Sleep fractured first. Dreams filled with slow movement, pressure. Corridors narrowing while water rose without sound. Many dreamed of walking calmly beneath the lagoon, breathing as if lungs were no longer required. Waking brought no relief, only the lingering sensation of weight pressing inward from all sides. Then came the marks. Bruises appeared along ribs and thighs, yellowed and finger-shaped, as if hands had tested the body's density. Some reported salt on their skin after bathing, though no seawater had touched them. Others found their palms wrinkled in the morning, as if they had been submerged for hours. A few heard it, not voices exactly, more like summons. A pull in the chest when near water, an urge to stop, to listen, to step closer to the edge. Rivers felt wrong. Baths felt too deep. Even rain caused unease, as if it carried memory. Those affected began to avoid mirrors. Reflections lagged slightly. Eyes seemed darker than before, pupils slow to adjust. In certain light, the skin took on the faint sheen of wet stone. One man, years after his visit, was found standing ankle-deep in the ocean at night, unmoving, tide rising around him. When pulled back, he wept, not in fear, but in grief, saying only, "It knows I was there." Local elders were not surprised. They said Nan Madol had always marked intruders. In the old days, those marks stayed close to the lagoon. Now, with the world open and borders crossed, the city's reach had stretched, not physically, conceptually. Those who had been noticed were never fully dry again, and some very few did not resist pull. They returned. Those who returned to Nan Madol rarely announced it. They simply stopped answering messages, stopped appearing in familiar places, stopped belonging to anywhere else. The pull did not feel like desire. It felt like recognition. They described it later, if they described it at all, as a certainty that something unfinished had noticed them, and that ignoring it was no longer possible. Water became an accusation. Distance became meaningless. Maps failed to represent what they needed to reach. Some arrived at the lagoon at night, alone, guided by nothing they could explain. Boats were found drifting at dawn, engines cold, oars laid neatly across the seats. No tracks led away from the shore. Witnesses, rare, frightened witnesses, spoke of figures walking into the canals without hesitation, clothes sinking, bodies lowering as if stepping onto stairs no longer visible. None thrashed, none called for help. They walked as if expected. Within Nan Madol, the phenomenon intensified. Shadows detached from their sources. Reflections moved independently, turning their heads a fraction too late. The water between certain islets deepened without reason, swallowing stone that had stood exposed at low tide for centuries. Those who lingered too long began to experience overlap. They felt two temperatures at once, heard two heartbeats, their own and another, slower one, resonating to the stone beneath their feet. Some reported the sensation of standing in multiple positions simultaneously, as if the city were testing which version of them belonged. At the center, near Nan Madol was, the air grew dense enough to resist movement. Breathing felt deliberate, effortful, as though the body were remembering an older method. And sometimes, only sometimes, the water rose just enough to form shapes, not figures, not faces, contours, suggestions of posture, of presence. The elders said this was the city rebalancing, that Nan Madol had been starved of attention for too long, then flooded with it all at once, that it had learned a new way to feed, not on offerings, not on ritual, but on awareness. To be noticed was to be weighed. To be weighed was to risk being kept. By now, no one doubted the city was alive. The question had changed. It was no longer what is Nan Madol, but what does it want to become? What surface was not new? That was the most disturbing realization. The elders had always said the Saudeleur was taken, not killed. For generations this had been treated as metaphor, a warning wrapped in story. But Nan Madol does not preserve metaphors. It preserves states. Beneath Nan Madol was, below the mortuary chamber where water never fully drains, something began to stabilize. Not a body. Bodies decay, even here, but a pattern, a concentration of will, memory, and command pressure, compressed until it no longer required flesh. Those sensitive to it felt a presence that did not move toward them, yet may escape feel irrelevant, like standing too close to a deep trench. Nothing pulls you in, but your body understands what would happen if it did. Dreams changed. People no longer dreamed of Nan Madol. They dreamed from inside it. They saw through water-dark vision. They felt stone as extension rather than obstacle. They experienced time not as sequence, but as accumulation. Layers pressing down, older events never leaving, only sinking deeper. And always, beneath it all, a center. The drowned ruler had not vanished. He had diffused. The Saudeleur no longer existed as a man, but as an organizing principle, authority without face, command without voice. The city had absorbed what he was best at and discarded the rest. In certain conditions, low tide, heavy cloud, absolute stillness, people reported hearing a thought that was not theirs. Stay, not spoken, Not heard, understood. Water around Nan Madol began to behave like membrane rather than liquid. Objects lowered into it felt resistance, then sudden absence, as if passing through layers with different rules. Ropes pulled back heavier than expected, frayed where nothing visible had touched them. One researcher vanished while diving near the central enclosure. His body surfaced days later far from the site, lungs full of water that did not match the lagoon's salinity. Nan Madol was no longer just remembering the Saudeleur. It was using him, and through him, it was relearning how to hold power without hands, how to rule without being seen. The first sign that Nan Madol had reached beyond itself was dismissed as coincidence. A cargo ship stalled hundreds of miles away, its engines failing simultaneously, crew reporting an unexplained pressure change in the hull, like deep water, though they were sailing calm seas. One sailor later described dreaming of stone corridors the night before the failure, though he had never heard the name Nan Madol spoken. Then came the patterns. People who had never visited Pompeii began reporting the same dreams as those who had. Submerged passageways, breathing without lungs, a sense of being evaluated rather than threatened. The dreams clustered around coastlines, harbors, estuaries, places where land softened into water. Researchers noticed something else. Old maps of Nan Madol, when placed beside modern satellite images, did not align perfectly, not because of error, but because the city appeared fractionally larger in newer imagery, additional shadows, extra angles where none should exist, not new construction, new definition. It was as if the place were asserting itself more clearly the more it was observed, collapsing uncertainty into form. Inland, elders began performing quiet, private rituals again, not to control Nan Madol, but to anchor themselves. They spoke of the city as one speaks of a former ruler who still influences policy long after death. The drowned king was no longer bound to the lagoon. He was bound to the idea of authority. Wherever people attempted to impose order too rigidly, to command without listening, to build systems that fed on obedience alone, echoes appeared. Dreams, failures, pressure, water behaving strangely where it should not. Nan Madol had become a template, not a location, but a lesson that enforced itself. Those most affected were not the curious or the fearful, but the controlling, planners, administrators, people who believed complexity could be mastered by structure alone. They reported sensations of narrowing, of being enclosed, of walls closing in that no one else could see. Some broke down, some withdrew, a few disappeared near water. The city was no longer calling individuals. It was calling patterns of thought and feeding on them. The elders said the balance had tipped too far once already, and the sea had answered. Now the answer was traveling through minds instead of tides. Nan Madol did not want worship. It wanted replication. There is always someone who believes they can stand closer than the others. They called it a controlled study, a convergence of archaeology, anthropology, acoustics, and what they carefully labeled anomalous cognition. They did not say paranormal. They said emergent behavior. They chose Nan Madol precisely because it was quiet, too quiet. The team arrived with permissions, instruments, and confidence sharpened by distance. None of them had grown up with the stories. None of them carried the old hesitations in their bodies. They believed knowledge insulated those who held it. They were wrong. They focused on Ndalwas. Sensors were lowered into the water. Seismic microphones were placed against the basalt. LiDAR scans traced the interiors of flooded enclosures, mapping space as a human I could no longer enter. At first, the readings were inconsistent. Noise, interference, baseline anomalies. Then the patterns began to synchronize. Vibrations beneath the stone aligned with tidal movement, not rhythmically, but intentionally, adjusting when observed, stabilizing when attention drifted. Acoustic feedback loops formed where none should exist, producing subaudible frequencies that caused nausea, disorientation, and a persistent sense of being watched from inside one's own chest. One researcher noted something that was never officially published. The data behaved like expected to be read. On the third night, they attempted the final test. They played back reconstructed Saudeleur chants, imperfect, speculative, stitched together from fragments, through underwater speakers placed near the central enclosure. The sound did not echo. It sank. The water thickened. Instruments failed in sequence, not randomly. Power cut and returned impulses too regular to be accidental. Then the city responded, not violently, not dramatically. The pressure changed. Every member of the team felt it at once. The sensation of being enclosed by something larger than space, something that did not surround them but included them. Thoughts slowed. Breathing felt optional. Memories surfaced in fragments not their own. One screamed. Another dropped to their knees, pressing their forehead to the stone, whispering apologies in a language they did not know. The eldest among them, the one who had insisted this was safe, smiled. Not with joy, with recognition. He said only, "It's listening." That was when the water began to rise, not flooding, not surging, but lifting carefully as if preparing a chamber. The city had not been awakened. It had been invited. After that night, no one could agree on what had actually happened. The official report spoke of equipment malfunction, psychological stress, environmental factors. Words arranged to close doors rather than open them. The team disbanded quietly. Funding was redirected. Data was archived and then, piece by piece, became inaccessible, corrupted files, unreadable formats, servers that failed without explanation. But the consequences had already escaped the lagoon. Those who had been present were no longer aligned with ordinary cause and effect. One returned home and found water collecting where it should not, beneath doors, inside cupboards, pooling on dry floors with no source. When he tasted it, it was salt, always salt. He began sleeping in a chair, afraid of lying down. Another developed a fixation on architecture, not design containment. He drew endlessly. Walls within walls, chambers without entrances, cities that folded inward. He said he was trying to remember something correctly before it finished remembering him. The eldest researcher, the one who smiled, never left Pohnpei. He was last seen walking toward the lagoon at dusk, barefoot, clothes neatly folded on a stone. Local fishermen later spoke of seeing a figure standing far out in the water, unmoving, long after a human body should have floated or sunk. After that, The dream spread faster. People with no connection to the project, no knowledge of Nan Madol, began reporting identical sensations. The feeling of standing inside something that was not a building, of being supported and constrained by the same structure. Some woke with the certainty that they had been assessed. The Drowned King's influence had changed again. It no longer waited to be noticed. It responded to attention itself. Every article written, every image shared, every theory proposed tightened the definition of the city just a little more. Nan Madol sharpened with awareness, growing clearer where it had once been blurred by distance and disbelief. The elders stopped warning outsiders. Instead, they began warning each other. They spoke of cycles, of moments when balance tipped and something ancient leaned forward, curious. They said this had happened before, long before the Saudeleur, long before stone, when the sea first learned it could hold memory. Nan Madol was not unique. It was simply the most successful attempt to give that memory form. And now that form was no longer content to stay still. They did not meet by chance. At first, it looked that way. Brief eye contact held too long in airports. The subtle pause between strangers who felt suddenly familiar. But those who had been marked by Nan Madol began to notice the pattern quickly. They recognized each other by absence, a certain stillness in posture, a way of standing as if weight were distributed differently, eyes that lingered on reflections rather than objects. When they spoke, conversation slid unnaturally toward water, toward pressure, toward places designed to enclose rather than welcome. None of them needed to mention the city. The name itself felt unnecessary, even impolite. They began to gather, not intentionally, not organized. Coffee shops near harbors, hotel bars overlooking rivers, conference rooms with poor ventilation and low ceilings, places where sound carried oddly and time felt compressed. When two or more were together, things happened. Condensation formed on glasses no one was drinking from. Electronic devices failed briefly, then resumed as if nothing had occurred. Dreams synchronized. The same corridor, the same turn, the same submerged threshold approached but never crossed. They shared fragments, a sense of being measured, the feeling of standing on stone that remembered being commanded, the certainty that something beneath the water was no longer asleep but occupied. Some began to hear it clearly now, not words, instructions, where to stand, when to leave, which structures to avoid, and which to enter. The Drowned King was no longer diffuse. He was recohering, not as a ruler of people, but as a geometry control, a way of arranging space, attention, and obedience so tightly that resistance collapsed inward. Nan Madol itself began to change in how it appeared to the world. Photographs taken months apart showed inconsistencies that could not be explained by tide or erosion. Walls seemed closer together, corridors narrower. The city looked more decided, as if it had chosen what it was. Elders spoke now of an old fear, rarely voiced before, that Nan Madol had never been a city at all, that it was a vessel, a place designed to teach something without words, something about hierarchy and closure and the danger of giving shape to command. And now that lesson was exporting itself. Those marked felt it in their bodies. a subtle reduction of choice, an ease in surrendering decisions, a comfort in being placed, positioned, contained. Freedom began to feel inefficient, and somewhere beneath Nan Madol was, something adjusted its weight, preparing not to rise but to extend. It began with efficiency. That was how it was sold. Systems redesigned to remove friction. Organizations restructured to eliminate uncertainty. Buildings planned with fewer windows, cleaner lines, tighter circulation. Spaces where movement felt guided rather than chosen. Those marked by Nan Madol gravitated toward these projects without ever naming why. They spoke the same language now, of flow, of optimization, of control as care. They did not build cities on water. They built them in process. Workplaces where hierarchy was invisible but absolute. Institutions where decisions appeared neutral, inevitable, as if no human hand had made them. Digital spaces where attention moved through channels as narrow and deliberate as the canals of Nan Madol. And it worked. People complied without fear, adapted without protest, accepted containment because it felt reasonable. The drowned king no longer needed stone. He had learned a better material. Human behavior. Those at the center of these structures began to experience the old sensations again. Pressure behind the eyes. The calming relief of surrendering complexity. Some describe moment of clarity, so intense it bordered on reverence. The feeling of being perfectly placed inside something larger than oneself. They slept well. They dreamed of corridors that aligned correctly. But there were costs. People at the edges of these systems felt it first. A subtle compression of possibility. The sense that every path narrowed toward the same outcome. That descent was not punished, merely absorbed and rendered irrelevant. Those who resisted described it as suffocation without hands, burnout without cause, anxiety without object. The feeling of living inside a structure that had decided their role before they arrived. Water imagery returned in their dreams, always rising, never rushing. And beneath it all, a presence that did not hate them, because hatred would imply conflict. This was use. Nan Madol had completed its evolution from city to ruin, to idea. The Saudeleur's greatest mistake had been believing command required visibility. Now command was everywhere and nowhere, and still, beneath the original stones, the old center remained, anchoring the pattern, remembering how this had been done before, waiting for the moment when enough of the world resembled a lagoon. Understanding did not arrive as insight. It arrived as relief. The woman who finally saw Nan Madol clearly had spent her life studying systems that failed quietly, bureaucracies that strangled themselves, technologies that optimized meaning out of existence. She had no interest in ruins, no patience for myth. She recognized a pattern because it was already inside her work. Nan Madol was not a haunted place. It was not a cursed city. It was not even alive in the way people insisted on meaning. It was a solution to an ancient human problem. How to hold order without trust. How to maintain authority without relationship. How to command without listening. The Saudeleur had not invented it. They had completed it. Nan Madol was what happened when control was made self-sustaining, when obedience was built into the environment so thoroughly that resistance felt irrational rather than dangerous. The water, the stone, the isolation, those were not symbols. They were interfaces. The drowned king beneath Nan Madol was not a ghost. He was a final stabilizing weight, the moment when human will collapse into structure and stop needing a human face. That was why it spread so easily now. Modern systems were already halfway there. Nan Madol did not impose itself. It simply resonated. The woman understood the horror then. You could not destroy it. You could not exorcise it. You could not expose it. Exposure only sharpened it. Nan Madol fed on attention, yes, but more precisely, it fed on the desire to manage complexity by removing choice. To stop it would require something no civilization had ever done willingly. Not rebellion, not revolution, not reform, but release, letting systems fail openly, allowing inefficiency, accepting disorder, choosing relationship over structure. In other words, undoing everything Nan Madol rewarded. She wrote this down once, not in a report, not in a paper. In a private notebook she later burned, because she realized something else, something colder. The city did not need to win everywhere. It only needed to remain possible. As long as humans feared uncertainty more than containment, Nan Madol would always be waiting, not as a place, but as a shape the world kept trying to become. And somewhere beneath the lagoon, the stone held its pressure, patient, perfect, unopposed. Long before Nan Madol learned to remember, before stone learned pressure, and water learned obedience, there was only Pohnpei breathing. Rain fell without purpose. Rivers wandered. The sea rose and fell without being asked to hold anything. People lived close enough to one another to argue, and far enough apart to forgive. Authority moved, loosened, tightened, and loosened again, never fixed long enough to harden. That was what was lost. Not innocence, not simplicity, flexibility. Nan Madol was born the moment someone decided that balance was too fragile to trust, that it needed to be held, contained, locked into shape. Stone was chosen because it does not argue. Water was chosen because it isolates. And for a time it worked. That is always a danger. Now the stone sit half submerged, dark with age, refusing collapse. The canals still trace their lines. The lagoon still breathes, slower there, heavier, as if remembering an old weight. Nan Madol no longer needs priests. It no longer needs rulers. It does not even need belief. It exists wherever control replaces listening, where systems are preferred to relationships, where silence is mistaken for order. But the circle is not entirely closed, because the island still exists. The forest still grows where no one commands it to. Rain still falls unevenly. People still sit together and tell stories that change slightly every time. And that change is not corruption, but life. The elders say this quietly now. Nan Madol can only grow where people are afraid of uncertainty. It cannot cross laughter. It cannot survive generosity. It cannot anchor where power is shared and released again and again. The drowned king remains beneath the stone, not sleeping, not waking, only waiting. But waiting is not winning. So the circle closes here, not with destruction, not with triumph, but with a choice that must be made again and again. To let things breathe, to let power move, to accept that no structure, no matter how perfect, should be allowed to become eternal. The lagoon remembers what happens when we forget that, and the island, still green, still wet with rain, remembers what came before the stones.